All right, I just want to start off with a discussion of a couple of great classics of environmental thought. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. These are both considered classics of environmental thought, and through them we'll get a taste of why it is that this new way of thinking caught on, what inspired people at the very beginning, you might say. And first we have Rachel Carson, whose work Silent Spring was actually first serialized in the New Yorker, a highly respected magazine. Still exists, probably has a lot more competition now than it did then, but it was and is considered a very reputable work that publishes a lot of literary material. And so by being serialized, coming out piece by piece in the New Yorker, it got a lot more attention, I think, than it would have gotten if it had just come out as a book. So she had the piece in the New Yorker, and then it also came out as a book in the same year in 1962. And it caught the imagination of a lot of people around the country, and a lot of things were written about it. So Linda Lear has an introduction in Silent Spring that covers quite a few of the highlights of Carson's work and her life. And she writes, Rachel Carson's alarm touched off a national debate on the use of chemical pesticides, the responsibility of science, and the limits of technological progress. When Carson died barely 18 months later, in the spring of 1964, at the age of 56, she had set in motion a course of events that would result in a ban on the domestic production of DDT and the creation of a grassroots movement demanding protection of the environment through state and federal regulation. So the use of DDT at this time was a big deal. You can get on the internet and see pictures of people just spraying DDT like a big fog out into streets and woodlands with no protective clothing on. Back in the 50s and early 60s, people just really didn't think about these things very much, is my estimation, just based on what I've read and heard. And just look at those pictures and you can see how little people really thought about it. They didn't think that they would be hurt by it somehow. But Lear says in the introduction, the Cold War, with its climate of suspicion and intolerance, was at its zenith. The chemical industry, one of the chief beneficiaries of post-war technology, was also one of the chief authors of the nation's prosperity. DDT enabled the conquest of insect pests in agriculture and of ancient insect-borne disease, just as surely as the atomic bomb destroyed America's military enemies and dramatically altered the balance of power between humans and nature. She also notes that in post-war America, quote, science was God and science was male, end quote. Carson was not a professor, and she had no academic affiliation, and she was a public writer. She was not, in other words, a technical or academic writer, but more like a journalist. And so Lear goes on to state that Carson grew up poor, but managed to get herself into the Pennsylvania College for Women, which is now Chatham College, it says. And she studied the English Romantic tradition, but then she got interested in science and decided to pursue a career in science, even though back in those days in the 1930s there weren't a whole lot of opportunities for women, especially in science. But she actually managed to get scholarships, and she ends up at Johns Hopkins University. And Lear says she was isolated, one of a handful of women in marine biology, had no mentors and no money to continue in graduate school, but she completed an MA in zoology in 1932. So she's called an ecologist here, and I think that term, it has implications of stepping back and kind of seeing the bigger picture of how the environment fits with humanity, and fits in a lot of different dimensions, not just economic, but moral and spiritual and political, social dimensions. Lear notes, quote, Carson's concept of the ecology of the human body was a major departure in our thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural environment. It had enormous consequences for our understanding of human health, as well as our attitudes towards environmental risk. Silent Spring proved that our bodies are not boundaries. Chemical corruption of the globe affects us from conception to death, end quote. And that might seem common sense to you, but like I said, that was not the case. I remember my dad, who grew up as a child in the Great Depression years, talked about how there was this, what was it called? It was a powder, and it had green in the title of it. It was this powder that they could use to combat insects in the fields, the tobacco fields in Kentucky. And I did look it up. I'll try to remember the name of it, but I looked it up. If you look at this stuff, it's like deadly, horrible, toxic stuff. But people they did seem to have the notion that what would kill an insect just wouldn't have any effect on them. I'm not sure how to explain that, but the revelation that everything that we put into our food supply comes back and gets into us and may very well harm us was something that people hadn't contemplated a lot about. And so anyway, that would be a major contribution of Rachel Carson's. Towards the end of the intro, Lear says, Rachel Carson knew before she died that her work had made a difference. She was honored by medals and awards and posthumously received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1981. So why read Silent Spring? Well, partly just to see how it's done. Let's just see how somebody's writing could have this level of impact, to get people's imaginations stirred up and to get people to think outside of their normal window of possibilities about how things might be and how things might be different. That right there is a good reason for reading her. So in chapter 1, which is entitled A Fable for Tomorrow, she starts out with this idyllic scene of a town in the heart of America where everything is in harmony, and all of nature is alive, and it's very, very beautiful and ideal, although I will say it sounds like a real town from, 100 years ago, perhaps. There's lots of animals, all sorts of wildlife to be seen. There's lots of beautiful wild plants of all kinds, flowering and fruiting. There's healthy farms with a lot of diversity of production, like orchards alongside fields of grain, alongside domesticated animals, cattle and chickens and things like that. She paints a really beautiful picture here, but not long into it, she talks about how people can fish the streams and watch the birds, and even in my childhood, I remember it being so easy to catch fish. We had several places to go around the Mississippi River where I grew up, both in the river and also in lakes and ponds in the area. And we'd almost always catch something. Now, in probably 15 years, I fish semi-regularly. I had one fishing trip where I caught multiple fish in the foreseeable years that I can remember in where I live now, in the lake that's nearby. It used to be that you could see frogs all the time, frogs, and when you looked into little streams, you could see minnows all the time, and lots of bugs. Anyway, that is not the case now, and I think that's what she's trying to bring out. Now remember, this was written in the early 60s, so even then there was a noticeable decline in the abundance that and vigor of nature. Well, after describing this ideal town, she then, in a sort of fable-like fashion, says a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens, the cattle, sheep sickened and died. Everywhere there was a shadow of death, and far fewer birds. We didn't hear the birds. The farm animals stopped reproducing healthy offspring. Apple trees didn't bloom. I mean, they bloomed, she says, but didn't fruit. The streams and lakes no longer had fish, so the fishermen stopped coming. And she says this wasn't really witchcraft. This was people's doing. And so she asks the question, what has silenced the voices of spring in countless towns in America, right? So that gives you the meaning behind the title, Silent Spring. She's not talking about a spring of water, she's talking about the season. And how in the spring you should hear the birds and you should hear the insects and the toads and the frogs just making a racket. And you still can in some places, but in a lot of places it's a lot less and it's a lot quieter than it used to be. So in the second chapter, which is entitled The Obligation to Endure, she says, only within the moment of time represented by the present century has one species, man, acquired significant power to alter the nature of this world. Then she makes the case that even though the Earth has long had natural radiation and has its share of what we would look at as natural disasters or, things within it that are deadly in and of themselves, like when a volcano erupts and kills off lots of the environment in the area, at least temporarily, Earth had a long, long time to adjust and was able to overcome these things. It had millions of years. It took millions of years, she says, to produce the life that now inhabits the Earth. But what human beings have introduced is very, very rapid change and the introduction of a lot of chemicals. She focuses in on chemicals in particular that human beings have been putting into the environment, more and more of them, exponentially growing, and without any notion of that they might harm the environment or harm people. She mentions strontium-90, a radioactive material, she says, released through nuclear explosions into the air, quote, comes to Earth in the rains or drifts down as fallout, lodges in the soil, enters into the grass or corn or wheat grown there, and in time takes up its abodes in the bones of a human being, there to remain until his death. Well, I think that it's lines like that bring us back to that point that the author of the introduction made about Carson's notion of ecology. It's holistic. It definitely includes people, and in fact, she always comes back to what's the impact on people, and do you realize that what you put into the environment comes back and lodges in your body? So it not only produces a silent spring for you, but also potentially reduces your health or may even kill you. So there's human beings haven't given and can't give the Earth the amount of time it needs to adjust to these constantly expanding amounts of chemicals. She says the figure is staggering and its implications are not easily grasped. 500 new chemicals to which the bodies of men and animals are required to somehow adapt each year, chemicals totally outside the limits of biological experience. Since the mid-1940s, over 200 basic chemicals have been created for use in killing insects, weeds, rodents, and other organisms described in the modern vernacular as pests, and they are sold under several thousand different brand names. And then she says a little bit further down, can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life? Then she mentions DDT, and she does something very interesting. It's very prophetic, that somebody in the early 1960s would see this, but she says, In mentioning DDT, she talks about the phenomenon of how insects and plants try to adapt to whatever poison is thrown at them, and so that means that we have to keep creating ever deadlier pesticides and herbicides, and that certainly did become a thing, even more than she could have ever known. Old pesticides and herbicides just aren't as effective as they used to be because nature is trying to fight back, and so people have had to create ever more sophisticated and deadlier ones, which of course makes their environmental impact that much worse. This reminds me of the point that Jacques Ellul makes in the Technological Society about human techniques and how technique kind of drives what we can do. He argues that if human beings can do something, they inevitably will, and when that method or technique that they've created produces a problem, they simply ask themselves, well, what technique can we develop that will remedy the problem, and so on and so forth. We'll see Wendell Berry making a similar point to that as well when we get to his writings. So she ends this second chapter commenting that we're told that enormous and expanding use of pesticides is necessary to maintain farm production, yet is our real problem not one of overproduction? Our farms, despite measures to remove acreages from production and to pay farmers not to produce, have yielded such a staggering excess of crops that the American taxpayers in 1962 are paying out more than $1 billion a year as the total cost of surplus food storage program. So and that's something that we're going to talk quite a bit about, is why do we do these things? Why is it that we feel compelled to continue to expand and improve and improve and expand, according to a certain set of principles anyway, to the point where we create an excess, which then, among other things, drives the cost of the commodity down, and of course provides a means for us to deliver food aid to other countries, which has its own both positive and negative effects. Do we really have to produce food the way that we do? Is it necessary for us to produce it to the level that we do? I know that we are told that it is absolutely necessary in order to, quote, feed the world, end quote, but that's an open question, and many of the authors that we're going to look at in this class will try to figure out some other way. We also do examine some people who think there is no other alternative. So this is a very important question that she raises right here in this classic piece. There are other ways to control insect predation and the problem of weeds, and many of our authors deal with these other solutions as well. Then we have section 2 of Silent Spring, Beyond the Dreams of the Borgias. I think it's safe to say that the theme of this chapter really is, hey consumer, you're being poisoned. She starts off by indicating that most people are going to experience kind of continuous small-scale exposures, and they're not going to notice because they're being exposed to chemicals in so many different ways, and but the effect of that year after year is going to add up. This whole chapter is designed to get the individual to be concerned for his or her own health and well-being, and so of course that got people's attention. She talks about how easy it is for the average person to get a hold of poisonous substances. She says, so thoroughly has the age of poisons become established that anyone may walk into a store and without questions being asked buy substances of far greater death-dealing power than the medicinal drug for which he may be required to sign a poison book in the pharmacy next door. Yeah, that's a good point. Even now, I'm sure that if you went to Home Depot, grabbed yourself a bottle of insecticide, and downed it, you might not be here. It is kind of interesting that there are warnings on these things, but they are poison. And she covers all the different ways the average consumer uses chemicals. Chemicals for keeping your kitchen clean, kitchen shelf paper with insecticide built in, floor cleaner with insecticide built in. I think that's a thing of the past. Creams and sprays for getting rid of mosquitoes and chiggers and other insects on your body. Clothing spray with DDT. That's something we don't have anymore, but we've got other pretty heavy-duty clothing spray that wards off ticks and other insects. But she says the Department of Agriculture in a home and garden bulletin advises us to spray our clothing with oil solutions of DDT, Deldrin, Chlordane, or any of several other moth killers. If excessive spraying results in a white deposit of insecticide on the fabric, this may be removed by brushing, the department says. Well, I guess that just goes to show that thinking that U.S. government is always going to know enough to protect you through regulation is probably wishful thinking. She talks about insecticides for the home garden and for applying to lawns, insecticides, and I suppose she doesn't mention fertilizers, but that probably ought to be mentioned. And she tells this story of a doctor who became an enthusiastic spare time gardener, she says. Now, this story is very effective. Remember, we wanted to talk about how a person can capture the attention and imagination of people and make them pay attention to something they hadn't thought of before. And telling stories like this is a big key ingredient, I think, in Rachel Carson's success. Here it is. She says, a physician who began using DDT and then malathion on his shrubs and lawn, making regularly weekly applications. Sometimes he applied the chemicals with a hand spray, sometimes with an attachment to his hose. In doing so, his skin and clothing were often soaked with spray. After about a year of this sort of thing, he suddenly collapsed and was hospitalized. Examination of a biopsy specimen of fat showed an accumulation of 23 parts per million of DDT. There was extensive nerve damage, which his physicians regarded as permanent. As time went on, he lost weight, suffered extreme fatigue, and experienced a peculiar muscular weakness, a characteristic effect of malathion. So with that story of that doctor in mind, and it's particularly effective because it was a doctor, somebody who might have known better, might have thought about it before he soaked his skin with something he didn't know really well what the effects of it would be. But even this doctor had this faith that if it was sold to him, it must be safe for him, I guess. And so I think that's a particularly effective story, which she then capitalizes on by talking about all the residues of DDT and other chemicals that are on our vegetables and fruits, and how they were advised to wash them, we still are, and peel off the outside layers of lettuces and cabbages, and how in animal fats, more of these chemicals are retained because fat retains them. She talks about how farmers are given advice about how to apply these chemicals, but oftentimes they do it incorrectly, probably partly because they just want to make sure that they totally eradicate the pests, and if a little does a good job, why not more? And then she ends this section with a discussion of the inadequacies of government inspection and regulation. She talks about how a bigger and better Food and Drug Administration is needed, but it's still going to be difficult for that. That can't be the solution ultimately, because it can only inspect food that is shipped through interstate commerce. And at the moment, she said, far less than 1% can be checked of that, even because they don't have enough personnel. But she does say that bigger Food and Drug Administration is necessary. But because that is ultimately not a good enough solution, she ends with public education as to the nature of chemicals offered for sale. being sadly needed. Now, we're going to have to see if that's ultimately the best solution she's got, but you can see Rachel Carson comes a long way towards our current situation where there is more and more attempt to educate the public, and therefore more demand from the public for assurances that their food is safe. I would say that's just getting started, but that's a legacy of Rachel Carson. And in chapter 12, entitled The Human Price, Rachel Carson goes into even more detail about the effects of chemicals on the body. So she says, more or less, I've talked about how chemical pollution affects the ecology of the natural world, but also I'm going to talk about the effects of these chemicals on the body's ecology and how the two interact. And I think, as the introduction stated, this is her, maybe her most significant contribution, is to focus upon the human body and human health, and to get people to kind of imagine and visualize this damage that is being done. So she starts off the discussion of the ecology of the body here on page 189 when she says, but there is also an ecology of the world within our bodies. In this unseen world, minute causes produce mighty effects. The effect, moreover, is often seemingly unrelated to the cause, appearing in a part of the body remote from the area where the original injury was sustained. Quote, a change at one point, in one molecule even, may reverberate through the entire system to initiate changes in seemingly unrelated organs and tissues, end quote, says a recent summary of the present status of medical research. She spends some time on the effects of toxins on the liver to get people to focus on their own body, basically, reminding people that the liver is the organ that is chiefly about drawing out the poisons and detoxing the food that enters the body. And so it holds on to these poisons, and it can itself be damaged, and then once your liver is damaged, it makes it very difficult for your body to be able to handle the incoming poisons or toxins. She says our line of defense against invading poisons or poisons from within is now weakened and crumbling. A liver damaged by pesticides is not only incapable of protecting us from poisons, the whole wide range of its activities may be interfered with. And a little bit further down on 192, she says it's interesting to note the sharp rise in hepatitis that began in the 1950s and is continuing a fluctuating climb. And cirrhosis is also said to be increasing. Well, I don't know if they are still, but those are two diseases of the liver that one can get also through alcoholism. So there's a way of kind of visualizing what damage can be done by chemistry that people, or chemicals that people would have been familiar with, because many people would have been well familiar, sadly, with cirrhosis of the liver caused by alcoholism. So to think that it could also be caused by exposure to DDT and other chemicals would have been something for people to contemplate. Again, there's a couple of stories here that surely caught people's attention. One was, it's a story of British investigators who deliberately exposed themselves, she says, in order to DDT, in order to learn the consequences. Two scientists at the British Royal Navy Physiological Laboratory invited absorption of DDT through the skin by direct contact with walls covered with a water-soluble paint containing 2% DDT overlaid with a thin film of oil. The direct effect on the nervous system is apparent in their eloquent description of the symptoms. Quote, the tiredness, heaviness, and aching of the limbs were very real things, and the mental state was also most distressing. There was extreme irritability, great distaste for work of any sort, a feeling of mental incompetence, and in tackling the simplest mental task, the joint pains were quite violent at times. Well, it's kind of amazing that these investigators actually deliberately experimented on themselves. I know these things happen, they're not supposed to happen, but people do that. And I think it probably happened more back then than it does now, but I dare say it probably still happens now. So that was unfortunate, but at the same time, they provided people with information that they needed to know, and then Carson publicized it here. She points out that in a human being outside the laboratory, like we all are for the most part, we're exposed to many different chemicals at once, and so it's not possible to really untangle the damage, and we can't know for sure whether the damage isn't compounded by the combination of chemicals people are exposed to. There's another story she talks about, which maybe you've heard of, but it's about ginger paralysis, and I'm going to read this because it's just an incredible episode in American history all around. She says, a bizarre happening in the United States during the Prohibition era about 1930 was an omen of things to come. It was caused not by an insecticide, but by a substance belonging chemically to the same group as the organic phosphate insecticides. During that period, some medicinal substances were being pressed into service as substitutes for liquor, being exempt from the Prohibition law. One of these was Jamaica ginger, but the United States pharmacopoeia product was expensive, and bootleggers conceived the idea of making a substitute Jamaica ginger. They succeeded so well that their spurious product responded to the appropriate chemical tests and deceived the government chemists. To give their false ginger the necessary tang, they had introduced a chemical known as triorthocresyl phosphate. Sorry about that. This chemical, like parathion and its relatives, destroys the protective enzyme cholinesterase. As a consequence of drinking the bootlegger's product, some 15,000 people developed a permanently crippling type of paralysis in the leg muscles, a condition now called ginger paralysis. So I remember being told about that in a different context, but again, that's a story that she tells that's designed to kind of wake people up, because a lot of people would have heard about that story, but wouldn't have necessarily said, oh, yeah, that's an example of what can happen to the human body when they're exposed to chemicals, whether they know it or not. So I'll stop this one here, and then in the next one I'll go into our selection from Leopold's Sand County Almanac. But I've focused in on the way that Rachel Carson communicated, because I think that's the most important takeaway here. She was persuasive because she had these great stories, she had this great ability to of this eloquence in her communication style, and then she also had significant scientific knowledge that she could communicate in a way that was understandable to the average layperson. And most importantly, perhaps, she focused in on what really impacted them, that in effect they should be worried about their own health, that they were not in some sort of hermetically sealed bubble, but that there was plenty of evidence that the chemicals that they were being exposed to in their food and in their environment would and did have a harmful effect on their health. And there's nothing more, immediately attention-grabbing than thinking that you might be sickened or your life might be shortened by exposure to chemicals. So all of that contributed to Rachel Carson's success.